Organized railroad workers call for nationalization of all rail lines. Hello guys, and welcome to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. Today we're going to be touching on the railroad potential strike that's been going on, the labor movement within the railroad workers associations and unions. We're going to be discussing this article right here that has a discussion on how railroad workers with the RUW have been discussing for the first time in about 100 years the idea of nationalization, the idea of nationalizing, putting under federal control all railroads in the nation. So without further ado, let's try to keep this video as short as possible and jump right into the reading here. We have this article from People's World, which I'm sure a lot of you watching already realize is sort of the media organ or the mouthpiece for the Communist Party of the United States of America. They do great work. They've been around for, I think, over 100 years now. They used to be called the Daily Worker back in the day. Now they're called People's World. Great article. Great media resource for anyone trying to find independent analysis about some of the economic and political issues we deal with today. So let's jump into this article from People's World here. It says, railroad workers say nationalization of rails is what democracy looks like. So in this country, we hear a lot about democracy, freedom, democracy. When we go to war overseas, we're bringing freedom and democracy to the people of the world, to the savage, autocratic barbarians of the world. We hear a lot about elections. We hear a lot about freedom of choice, blah, 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 all this type of stuff, right? And ostensibly, yes, we do have elements of democracy. But when you get to our economy, there's little to no democracy at all in this country. You know, if you look at the way that our capitalist economy, our capitalist society is oriented, it's all oriented around private ownership, private accumulation. All of the work in our society is done socially. We have social production. That is the mass of working people, the proletariat, if you want to use Marxian language, do all the labor to produce all the value. However, we do not have social accumulation. We have social labor, social production, but we do not have social accumulation or social ownership. We have private accumulation. So that means that all the work that we do for nearly every sector of the economy, there are some variables or instances where that's not the case, maybe city waterworks and things like that. But the accumulation of all the value created goes to private individuals, right? And it's done through the organ, as you know, of a company or a corporation, which is a top-down, autocratic, totalitarian, authoritarian system or organ, right? In this country, we hear that democracy and capitalism are synonymous, but in reality, they are not, okay? Because while you may be able to, let's say on paper, we could have a discussion about what liberal democracy actually is. But on paper, you get to vote for politicians to make decisions politically and maybe in the economy. But in reality, the majority of where you spend most of your day in the workplace is a non-democratic institution. You have zero say in the kind of work you do, in the way that the profits are spent, and in the way that the processes are done. And you have zero say in who gets the wealth. And obviously, you're not getting it as well. So what we're getting into here with this article, sorry for the little preface, is these railroad workers are talking about nationalization and how to them nationalization, democratic control of this municipality, of this utility, is in essence democracy in the economic sphere. Let's do some of the reading here, guys. It says, from Las Vegas, for the first time in slightly more than 100 years, Railroad Workers United is demanding public ownership of railroad infrastructure in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Then railroads would be operated in the public interest, it says, quote unquote. Unlike the major media in the U.S., which tries to divorce the threat to democracy from the fight for economic justice, their call for nationalization, clearly a demand for economic democracy, is an aspect of democracy that papers like the New York Times don't touch with a 10-foot pole. And again, guys, yes, going back to my little preface before getting into the reading here, it's exactly what we're talking about. Media, corporations, what you learn in school, they're never going to teach you that aspect of democracy. You cannot have a democracy without economic democracy. And in the United States, we live in economic authoritarianism, the dictatorship of capital. where the wealthiest Americans, in all reality, have complete control of your political system as well, as I'm sure you already know, 99% versus the 1%, right? But beyond that, whatever little semblance of democracy is there in the political sphere, there is absolutely no democracy in the workplace, in the economy. And even beyond the authoritarian structure of a corporation, these corporations have bought up all the access to the government. They pollute our environment. They destroy our cities. They hollow out small businesses. They hollow out civic infrastructure. They empty the coffers of government, et cetera, et cetera. Doing some more reading here, guys. Says, witness the second day in a row today when their lead story portrays public belief that democracy is in danger simply as nothing much more than Democrats and Republicans not trusting one another. The wealth gap fueled by lack of economic democracy never comes up in polling on which they base their story. For the railroad workers, democracy is impossible without economic justice, and their push for nationalization is itself a fight for democracy. And we're here with you on that one, People's World. RWU's steering committee unanimously approved the public ownership resolution on October 6th and posted it for comment by rail workers, unions, and other interested parties, including the rest of the labor movement. There have been no responses yet. All right, so what do we have here from this little segment in the reading? In the news right now, you hear constantly that from Democrats that democracy is under siege. They'll cite January 6th riots, all these conspiracies with right-wing militias or associations trying to apparently overthrow democracy. You'll hear discussion about voting rights. And now, clearly, these issues are important. The already anemic democracy that we are in is facing a whole new barrage of different things, from the outlandish gerrymandering that goes on with Republicans. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of this, but apparently there's a Supreme Court ruling going to be heard on, or discussion going to be had around an appeals court that's going to Supreme Court that talks about, I don't know how to word this as simply as possible, but what it's going to do is essentially do away with one person, one vote, because it's going to strip the federal government of the power to manage and appropriate proper standards for state and local elections, right? So essentially there will be no federal oversight for how states and municipalities run their elections, okay? So they can do all kinds of shit to strip away, the ability to reach a polling place, the ability to have a from home ballot, all this kind of stuff. That's a discussion for maybe another time. We could do a whole video on it. But we do have these assaults going on political democracy, on electoral democracy, what little of it there is. I mean, it's been going on for years with Citizen United, the influence of dark money. But on that note, we can talk about what they say here, how we'll hear all the time about January 6th, about, voting rights and stuff, but we'll never hear about how corporate America, how corporate domination has completely hollowed out democracy. And the fact that these handful of corporations own literally every sector of the economy. They own the trains, they own the planes, they own the grocery stores, the warehouses, they own the office buildings, the boutiques. They own everything. They own all the retail giants. They own food production. They own the farmland, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You're never, ever going to hear on mainstream media and from corporate, they own the news too, wouldn't you have it? You're never going to hear about how corporate domination of our entire society has hollowed out democracy, right? And these railroad workers, for the first time in 100 years, and we can have a discussion as well about how that's huge, how that is a sign of the sort of coming of age again of socialism in this country, that we're having these sort of nationalization discussions. But this fight that they are pushing, RUW, is a huge fight for democracy. And any of us that are socialists or communists, we're going to preach this at you, obviously, and we need to continue to do so. That, when Democrats talk about, democracy under siege, we need to always be bringing it back to how capitalist society perpetually lays siege to democracy as a whole. Some more reading here for you guys. Says the GOP's attempt to gain support by blasting Biden for inflation, for example, masks the fact that GOP lawmakers are a key part of the undemocratic caucuses of representatives that prevent any curbs on corporate price gouging. An excess profit tax, which they oppose, would be a democratic intervention in the fight against the corporate price rigging. Measures like that and the nationalization of transportation networks both would be major steps towards fixing democratic and economic issues at the same time. And I would agree with that, but I'd go one step further saying nationalization of really most industry, right? And as far as the windfall tax, this corporate profits tax that they're talking about, I mean, I guess, but it's just going into the imperialist pro-corporate tax coffers of, our liberal democracy. So I don't know how much that does, right? But it's better than nothing, I guess. And alongside the things that they're talking about here, nationalization, democratization, windfall tax, we also need to be having a discussion about price controls in the midterm, in the meantime. While, nationalization's put onto a bigger discussion, nationalization of oil would be huge as well. Let's go on here, guys. RWU says more than a decade of declining service, quote unquote, by the nation's freight railroads show rail bosses are more interested in satisfying Wall Street interests and profits and dividends than in carrying out the road's legal mandate to provide freight service to shippers, customers, and the country. Federal ownership, it declares, would reverse that priority. The organization, which includes rank and file rail workers cutting across union lines in all rail crafts, also notes other transportation infrastructure, subways and bus systems, roads, bridges, and airports, is by and large publicly owned, with lower overhead and better working conditions. So, that's a discussion we've been having for a while, is the sphere around nationalization or democratization, right? We've had this stuff for a long time in a lot of spheres of the economy, maybe less so than in other countries around the world, right? But it's nothing new and it's nothing fucking scary. It's not the government boogeyman coming to take your rights away because they now have ownership of the railroads. How fucking stupid are you? You don't have any control over the railroads now, motherfucker, and you're not going to start a goddamn railroad company. You're not even going to start the small business, restaurant, or barbershop, most likely, because you don't have access to capital. So you sure as fuck ain't going to be building no damn railroads. You ain't going to be building no new lines. So this fear-mongering that comes from right-wingers about it's going to inhibit our democracy and our free markets. Fuck it, man. Come on, man. Be reasonable here. But with this part of the reading, I want to have a discussion as well about, when you nationalize industry, you're taking out the profit incentive. Okay. And as we'll get into the reading here more, we'll see what the profit incentive has done to the service of railroading, how it has increased the cost of everything, how it has, resulted in the firing of workers. It makes everything more expensive. Okay, just how with when the price of oil goes up, therefore the price of energy goes up, the price of everything else goes up too, right? Because it costs more to get things to where they're going or to produce the things that need to be made, the price of everything else goes up too. When it comes to railroading, to shipping, to shipping lanes on the high seas as well, but particularly with railroading, when you put corporations in control of the freight lines, and they stand to make a profit from shipping, well, now that profit line, that profit margin that they have, increase the costs of everything else being shipped because they have to make money out of it, okay? When the government runs it, there is no need to make a profit. The government just has to make enough money in revenue to make sure that the workers are paid decently, to make sure that the railroads are kept up, and ideally advancing in reinvesting into the railroads and modernizing them as well. Maybe some public transportation countrywide in that department as well, right? So that's something I wanted to touch on with this little segment here is the benefits that we can have from democratization, from nationalization. Some more reading here, guys. Says the rail industry has come to focus solely on the quote-unquote operating ratio of profits to revenues as a measure of their success, and in doing so have engaged in massive stock buybacks and other measures that deliver short-term gains for stockholders, but at the expense of long-term health and vitality of the industry, RWU's resolution says. The Class I carrier's failure to move freight effectively has contributed greatly to the ongoing supply chain crisis, resulting in some of the highest inflation rates in many years. It adds, a crisis made worse by cutting 29% of all rail workers since 2014. Other workers have left due to stagnant pay and terrible working conditions. No surprise there. Okay, so what do we have here with this segment, guys? Again, coming back to using the profit motive. But let's zoom out. Let's zoom out beyond the railroads with this. Let's have a discussion about using the profit method, the profit motive, as the fundamental driving force in your society, right? So right here in the case of the railroads, we talk about how the railroad industry has come to focus solely on the operating ratio of profits to revenues as a measure of their success. Okay, so let's talk about that on a big scale. First off, with the railroad. A railroad's job, what is a railroad's job? It is to get freight and supplies and raw materials and human beings to wherever they need to go from wherever they started for as cheap as possibly and as efficiently as possibly and safely as possibly. Okay, these railroads aren't looking at that anymore. They're not looking at that at all anymore. All they're looking at is numbers on the screen. How much money is this making motherfuckers on Wall Street? Now let's talk about how insane that is to run railroads. The cardiovascular system, the veins of your entire civilization, of your entire nation. How insane it is to run that on a profit method. Okay. How detrimental it is to the economy, like we talked about, where every other sector of the economy essentially is dependent on a efficient and economically driven and efficient railroad system, right? Now let's zoom that out. Let's look at that at the whole society. Profit motive, numbers on the screen. I got more out of it than I put in it financially, is the driving force for every single aspect of our society, from economic to social, for the airplanes, for the railroads, for the restaurants, for food production, for internet access, for meat, anything you can think of. Excuse me. Everything is driven by profit. Okay. That's fucking insane. Let's think about what happens when you run your food production for profit. Well, you already know. You end up with Doritos and Cheetos and salty snacks and fatty foods that are bad for people, that cause diabetes, that cause cancer, that cause all kinds of health concerns. Right. You know, what happens when you run media and entertainment solely for profit? Well, you get artists left out that could produce a better product, a better piece of art, a better piece of entertainment. You get lowest common denominator entertainment in music and in movies and all this. What happens when you run your postal service for profit? You get broken packages, you get shitty shit, you get slow delivery times. Okay, instead of it being about getting the packages there as quickly as possible, it's about mass, it's about scale, it's about getting workers to do more than is humanly possible in the shortest amount of time, right? Okay, and we could talk about that. Running your, national security, which is by and large dictated by for-profit arms manufacturers, merchants of death, weapons armament salesmen. Okay, they are running national security. Foreign policy. What happens when you have arms manufacturers, war merchants, making money, making profit the primary motive of national security? Well, we've seen what you get. You get an endless series of overseas wars that amount to nothing except bloodshed and death and imperialism, but it makes them rich. That's what you're running your national security on, your foreign policy on, the profit motive. Even going into a country that doesn't have anything to offer the imperialists. Well, guess what? it offers us a fat fucking bank check from the federal government because we got tanks and bombs and missiles and all this shit to sell. Kevlar, helmets. Every soldier that dies, that's another uniform, another helmet, another rifle that's got to be produced. Another 5,000 bullets. Right. So you're running, everything in this society is run off the profit motive. And it's absolute insanity. It's a sickness that I can't even, articulate here. I'm sure some novelists have done a better job than I could in a million years here. Right. So that's what we're looking at in this segment here. Let's do a little more reading, huh? The Fortune 500 corporations among the big freight railroads, including the Class I freight railroads, Burlington Northern Santa Fe, CSX, Norfolk Southern, Union Pacific, and the Kansas City Southern, raked in record profits in both good years and bad, right through the Great Recession, the pandemic, and otherwise, right up to the most recent quarterly financial announcements, RWU notes. In evidence presented to the federal government, rail unions have noted that since the job cuts began, the big freight railroads have garnered $146 billion combined in profits. Absolute insanity. And earlier it talked about the supply chain issues. That's a large part of that is because, as we saw here, what's the number? They cut 29% of all rail workers since 2014. I'm sure that didn't help our supply chain issues. Okay. I'm sure adding to the cost of shipping, the shipping costs, didn't help inflation, did it? So what are we looking at here? We're looking at a private corporation running the freight lines that our entire society is dependent on, running it for profit and doing a fucking incredibly shitty job at that. And still doing the shittiest imaginable job, running one of the most important aspects of the economy and infrastructure, and still making $146 billion in profits. It's sick. And nationalization will go a long way in changing that. Let's keep on with the reading here, guys, all right? It says, rail bosses oppose safety improvements. Rail bosses have also opposed or delayed safety improvements, fought their unions tooth and nail, and given that they own almost all rail tracks in the U.S. outside the Boston-Washington Northeast Corridor, hamstrung Amtrak too, RW said. The bosses have taken a hostile stance towards unions, refused to bargain in good faith, consistently demanding concessions, all the while expecting these essential workers to labor through the pandemic without a wage increase, it adds. Yeah, meanwhile, they're making $146 billion in profit. So imagine if you took even let's say you even took one 1,000th of that $146 million. You could give everybody in working for the railroads essentially a several $1,000s a year raise. Imagine how much of a huge difference that would make. For another 1/100th of it, you could completely update half of it and make it safer for these workers as well. It's inhumane. Running any sort of aspect of the economy, most aspects of the economy, running it for profit is just inefficient, it's wasteful, and it's inhumane half the time. Some more reading here, guys. It says, the nation's big Class I freight railroads have historically been in private hands. Although the government had to create and manage Conrail in 1976, lawmakers erected it out of the bankrupt ruins of the unwieldy amalgamation of Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central, plus 4 other northeastern Midwestern railroads. Conrail became profitable and went to public stock offering in 1987. A decade later, Norfolk Southern and CSX bought it and split it up, leaving only the local service. A check of historical records and abstracts, as well as a more modern analysis, shows state and local governments operate just over 100 small railroads. They're usually former branch lines for the big trunk railroads, operated to keep service going to local shippers. Some governments contract out the actual operations, Transportation Quarterly reported in its most recent study. So we got a couple of things here. We have this instance of the government creating and managing Conrail. So what happened is a bunch of these littler, although still quite large railroads, either went bankrupt or had litigation against them. Something happened where these railroads were fucking up and they weren't working well. So the government seized them, fused them all together, moved some shit around. And then because it didn't have to have this profit revenue for shareholders, it was able to reach a level of profitability again, of efficiency, that it was a functioning fucking railroad that was capable of delivering service. But we live in a capitalist society. So what happened? Why wouldn't you just leave it to be nationalized, ran by the federal government or state government? Well, because this is a free market, man, and we got people trying to make a hustle. So what did they do? Instead of it staying that way and maybe expanding it and having the federal government use the profitability of this particular railroad to buy others that were in derelict or defunct economic condition, they sold it. They sold it back to some fucking railroad mogul. And then what did they do? They chopped it up, split it down the middle for the rest of them, and discontinued a bunch of tracks. And some of these tracks, the only way they were able to stay open is because local, either state or city governments bought up little pieces of it to make sure that these communities here, this business here, was able to still have access to the railroads. It doesn't fucking work. Going on here, the closest analogy to what RWU wants was the 1918 Railroad Control Act, an emergency measure giving the federal government management take over the nation's rail lines to ensure the shipment of military personnel and supplies during World War I. The feds ran the railroads for the duration of the war and could do so up to 21 months after. Why not in perpetuity? Especially because you got all these American GIs with guns fresh back off the boat, knowing how to fight. I'd like to see the railroad moguls and their hired Pinkertons fucking fight them off. Ain't nobody coming for that railroad if you want it, federal government. Its end, the reference book says, actual control began in March 1918 and lasted 26 months. The government compensated rail firms for their use of stock and tracks, and it improved working conditions and pay. At the end, the repeal law turned the railroads back to their owners, some of the nation's wealthiest capitalists, because they have control over, one of the most important aspects of the economy and infrastructure, also gave the government more regulatory power over rail rates and routes. So what do we have here? In both these instances, the 1976 with Conway Rail and then the 1918 Railroad Control Act for World War I, we have instances of the federal government having control of the railroads, and it wasn't scary and it didn't fuck with your working class life. As a matter of fact, it made it better. RWU noted that at the end of the war, U.S. rail workers voted 306,720 to 1,466 to keep the railroads nationalized. So did the 1920 American Federation of Labor Convention. The weighted vote was 29,159 to 8,349. But union leaders wanted the return of private ownership. Bad union leaders. This time, RWU says the craft unions should back federally ownership of all railroad infrastructure. Okay, so let's see here. Okay, so here's the point I want to make with this segment. These votes after nationalization, when there was the period where they were transitioning it back to private ownership, putting it back in the hands of capitalists from the federal government, you had the complete and total mass of rail workers voting democratically that they would like to keep nationalization. Now let's have a discussion here. We're supposed to live in a democracy, right? Yet these workers that run the railroad and do every single inch and iota in blood and sweat and molecular level of work for the railroad. They run the railroad. They voted that they wanted to keep it nationalized. Didn't matter. Still went to private hands. Does that sound like democracy to you? Oh, well, it's a free market and property rights are an essential, part of having a democratic society. Okay, the government paid them above and beyond the cost of the government seizing control of the railroads. You want to be democratic about it and make sure that the property rights of the capitalists are valued? All right, I'll concede to you because I'd like to guillotine them and then fry them up and cook them in a big pot to feed all the people that are hungry around the world. That's what I propose. If you'd like that, drop a like, drop a comment if you're in boat with me and making a giant rich people soup. but I'm willing to compromise because I believe in democracy. We'll put it to a vote. Rich people soup or paying the capitalists for their property. Okay. Whatever. If you want to be like that, we'll pay them for the property. Property rights solved. Workers that run the whole thing have decided they want it nationalized. Okay? Pay the fucking capitalists. Let's nationalize it. You got what you wanted, all right? Let's finish this reading here, guys. It says, in the last 4 years, the rail industry has shed nearly a third of its workforce, and it clearly intends to continue that trend as it pushed for dangerous and inefficient single-crew operations of trains and self-protecting freight pools. RWU Steering Committee members Paul Lindsay, speaking for the group, said in a statement, if the carriers get their way at the bargaining table, the workforce will continue to decline in numbers along with safety, efficiency, and service. The Class I carriers are moving less freight today than 16 years ago, and they are doing a poor job with that. Rail shipments and travel should be expanding in today's world, not contracting. Otherwise, RWU warns more freight shippers will turn to highway vehicles. Reliance on them, it said, threatens to bankrupt and destroy towns and cities across the country and contribute to ecological disaster due to carbon emissions which cause global warming. So we got several things there. I mean, that's an aspect maybe you don't even think about. I'm sure somebody here in the comments did have or viewing this right now did have that in mind. But, in this modern era where the amount that is being produced of material goods is expanding, and we're seeing countries all over the world, in particular spearheading the way with the Belt and Road Initiative, China, expanding freight services for both human beings and freight. Here in the United States, we're seeing it contracting, and it's a result of essentially Wall Street speculators coming in and scalping it of every fucking red penny, at the detriment to not only the workers, but to all of us that are trying to live in a functioning, fucking sane society. Okay. And let's zoom out again, how we like to do in this channel. The contracting shipping of freight is another example of this society being in a terminal state of fucking decay. In a period where we are having supply chain issues, in a period where the global economy is it's contracting now, but has been growing, and the amount of things needing to be shipped has been growing, and other countries like China are blowing us out of the water in this, tenet of the economy, we're falling behind. The vascular system of our society, as we compared it to, is clogged. The arteries of our society are clogged. And what's clogging it? Rich capitalists. Blocking the blood, the lifeblood of the economy, the shipment, the freight, the raw materials, the consumer goods. These capitalists have wheedled their way, have congealed in the arteries of our society with their profit motive. And they are stopping blood from reaching the brain and the body of our society. And it's hurting all of us. And something needs to be done about it. And these railroad workers, which, as you know, have been debating on the idea of going on strike. They've been having lots of labor movements and sitting down, as they talked about, with the bosses. They're taking it even a step further, and that's amazing. That's amazing for all socialists to see. It's a spearhead in the right direction of the working class becoming more militant. And if they were to get their way with this, and as we know, our government's completely bought and paid for by capitalists, so I don't necessarily want to hold our breath. But the fact that these workers are fighting for it is huge. And if they were somehow to get their way, that would be a huge step in the right direction of freeing up so much economic potential throughout all of our society. But yeah, guys, that's all I have for you. I just wanted to share this article for you and try to break it down as fast as I can. Considering it was a lot of content, I think I did all right. Drop a comment with your thoughts. What are your thoughts about nationalization? Say we were to actually transition to a socialist economy. What would you want that mix to look like with private ownership, with worker co-ops, with nationalization? Do you kind of like some of the things they're doing in China? Do you want to go a different route? What does the economic aspects of socialism in the United States look like? And what role does nationalization play in that? Drop a comment. Let me know what you think about that. But yeah, guys, as I said, that's all I have for you. Thanks for watching. As always, I love you very much, and I'll speak again soon. Bye.